You know what is wrong with this campaign in Battlefield 5? What exactly is wrong here? What is not right here? Something that is essential to the gameplay of a first-person shooter. What is wrong here is that not a single German soldier was killed during the Commander raid in Norway that this campaign is based on. In fact, resistance groups in Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium and France barely ever engaged in the deliberate targeted killing of German soldiers in their countries right up until the Allied forces were on the horizon. There's a simple reason for this. The German army reacted viciously to any such activity. If a German soldier was killed by a resistance group, the reaction came in gruesome force. When an SS officer was kidnapped by members of the resistance in the French region of Limousin, the Waffen-SS rolled into Oradour-sur-Glane, rounded up all the men and boys in a barn, all the women and girls in a church, and set both on fire. These scenes repeated themselves throughout all countries occupied by the Germans. Acts of aggression against the German occupiers were punished with the destruction of entire towns in the region and the slaughter of their entire populations. Many resistance movements throughout Europe did not wish for these reprisals to be suffered by their fellow countrymen. And for that reason, resistance groups in many countries refused the targeted assassination of German soldiers. We have a romanticized image of resistance in Nazi-occupied countries. Depicted in cinema and video games alike, we have an image of a guerrilla war being fought in the French countryside, ambushing German convoys and blowing up barracks and trains full of German soldiers. This, however, isn't the case.
I'm sorry. Who the hell?
Fighting such an underground war would have come with the horrific reprisals inflicted by the German occupying forces. Only few countries and their peoples were willing to make that sacrifice. If you wish to have a campaign or even game based in historical accuracy where you play as a member of the resistance fighting German occupation, the only way to do so would be by placing you in Greece, Italy, Yugoslavia or Poland. But making such a campaign comes with problems. How far can you go in depicting the war crimes committed by the Germans? And how do you show the historical injustices that these resistance fighters had to suffer under? Do you remember the outrage after the release of Company of Heroes 2 and its depiction of Polish resistance members getting murdered by Red Army soldiers? Well, thing is, that happened. When the Red Army wrestled control of Poland from the German army, the Red Army started fighting a war against Polish resistance fighters in 1944, an entire year before Nazi Germany had even been defeated, while the Western Allies watched and did nothing. Would you be willing to step into that political minefield as a game developer? It is probably for this reason that many movie directors and game developers have throughout time simply placed their stories or you into a guerrilla war in Western Europe that actually never happened. From shooting hundreds of Germans with the Dutch resistance in Call of Duty to the Norwegian campaign in Battlefield 5. Expectancy of realism in any first-person shooter set in such a scenario of resistance is something you shouldn't have in the first place. Games are idealized scenarios. They're not historical lectures. Video games based in historical settings are basically the game industry's version of Hollywood's based on true events. The history part comes second. But on the basics, when it comes to the Norwegian campaign in Battlefield 5, I believe the developers should be praised for the decision they made, or at the very least be encouraged to go further down that road. Why? 20 years ago, the first-person shooter genre was oversaturated with World War II shooters. From the Medal of Honor series to Call of Duty to Battlefield, the scenario you were placed in was almost always the Second World War, and one of the reasons players kept turning away from this was the constant reuse of the same missions and same scenarios. Almost every game had you charging the beaches of Normandy, the same hedgerow battles of Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the obligatory Stalingrad level. Right at the end of the popularity of the World War II setting is when developers finally took you elsewhere, placing you in the Pacific or the Battle for Berlin. What the Battlefield developers tried to do is to do something different with Battlefield 5, to place you into a story that has not yet been told, breathing fresh air into a scenario by not having you charge up the Normandy beaches again. Picking which scenario to go for in campaigns seems to be where the developers had their difficulties. The developers would have done well to hire historical advisors, not to make a game that is 100% historically authentic, but to point them into directions. It seems there was a need for a Swedish developer to have Scandinavia's story during this war represented, and in doing so the development team would have done better at asking historical advisors on what potential there is in Scandinavia, since there are in fact a lot of stories to be told. When the Germans invaded Norway, they clearly believed that it would go like their invasion of Denmark, which surrendered after only a day with barely any fighting. The Norwegians, though, welcomed the Germans by sinking Germany's most modern battlecruiser using outdated cannons from the 19th century. They sank German transports, shot down German troop transport planes, and delayed the German plans for invasion. They fortified positions in the countryside and kept fighting for every inch of the country. It is often overlooked today, but out of all the Western European nations invaded by the Germans, Norway held out the longest, in fact fighting longer than Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium and France combined, even delaying German plans for the invasion of France. The Germans were forced to gradually and slowly fight their way north. For a moment it must have looked as if the Norwegians would even tie down the Germans, that the Germans would find themselves in the same kind of freezing Scandinavian mess the Russians found themselves in Finland in the previous year. Especially with French and British support arriving, the possibility seemed real that this tiny country with its tiny army, tiny navy and tiny air force would hold its ground. However, with the invasion of France, the British and French pulled out of Norway, and the Norwegian army, now hopelessly outnumbered, surrendered. It must have been a bittersweet experience for the Norwegian soldier, fighting against the elite German mountain troops and paratroopers that were sent to finally squash the Norwegians, inflicting heavy losses against the Germans, having a victory in sight just over the horizon, and to then just have it glide out of your hands.
Kom in, kommando! In!
It's a mark of pride to Norwegians, well represented in their popular history, folklore and culture, that they managed to keep fighting for such a long time despite the odds being overwhelmingly stacked against them. The shorelines of Norway are littered to this day with wrecks of German ships, and it's also of note that the Norwegians never officially surrendered. Battlefield 5 has a multiplayer map set in Narvik, which was one of the hardest contested battles in Norway. But you play as the British or Germans. You have equipment present that didn't even exist during that time. The Battle of Narvik was contested by Norwegian infantry, the French Foreign Legion, Polish mountain troops in French exile, some light French tanks, and British infantry against German paratroopers and mountain troops. There's of course a need for liberties to be taken by developers. Not everyone can be accurately represented, but to have a map in Norway, to have the goal of representing its often untold stories, and to then not allow the player to play as a Norwegian, it seems to be a large miss made by the developers. A mistake that could have easily been avoided. A campaign set during these 3 months in Norway would have been a great decision. It would have also given the opportunity to develop new mechanics and features for the game and even new classes for multiplayer. The Germans may have had light vehicles and heavier weapons, but the Norwegians had agile ski troops with white camouflage coats who knew the terrain. Where the Germans had to slowly stomp through thick and deep snow, the Norwegian soldier put on his skis and glided from position to position, hidden from sight by their white coats. A multiplayer match in which one side has the heavier weapons but the other has the advantage of speed, agility and camouflage would be an interesting concept. The weapons used by the Norwegians have also not been seen in any previous games, from Norwegian rifles to Danish machine guns to Swedish submachine guns that the Norwegian army was equipped with. But additionally, the Norwegian story doesn't end there. The vast bulk of the Norwegian forces in exile consisted of pilots, of which many had managed to escape and formed fighter and submarine hunter squadrons in the Royal Air Force, as well as some submarines and battlecruisers and 1,000 merchant navy ships that would engage in the battle for the Atlantic. However, those soldiers who did escape their country to Britain were recruited into a commando unit stationed on the Shetland Islands in northern Scotland. There they were trained by Royal Marines in sea-to-land combat, and starting from 1943, under the designation Number 10 Commando, conducted dozens of coastline raids. landing at various points in Norway, destroying factories, mining equipment, radio stations, ships and German garrisons, and then disappearing back into the sea.
Assault landing craft, ALCs to the commandos, approach the rocky shore. With the troops go a picked body of British newsreel and official cameramen, risking everything to bring you a faithful record of the raid. The main landing is at the little town of South Forkso.
The exiled Norwegians spent 2 years continuously harassing the Germans along the lengthy coastline of Norway. After the liberation of France, No. 10 Commander's ocean-to-land raids ended, the troops were restationed into Belgium to fight in the Netherlands. Its new purpose was to be the first troops to land on the many Dutch islands still held by the Germans, to establish beachheads and clear the islands. After the islands had been taken, the Norwegian commanders were stationed at the border river Maas. Their new job was to continuously cross the river, go behind enemy lines, gather intel or cause havoc, and then disappear back into the river. There are Norwegian stories to tell, which is often forgotten despite it being unique and thrilling. The developers went through a lot of effort to create a Norwegian story. The fact that it is even narrated in Norwegian is a great positive. But by attempting to make it as special as possible and twisting scenarios, settings and characters together, created something that doesn't really make too much sense and angered many who played the game. Instead of returning to the same stories that have been told so many times before, the developers should be encouraged to try again. These are scenarios and settings that would breathe a welcoming breeze of fresh air into an overused setting. How much would you enjoy playing these stories in a game yourself?